Welcome, friends. Today we are joined by Chris Blackburn for our second interview session. And I'm Abhinav Pandya, CEO of Sanas Foundation. I'll be interviewing Mr. Chris Blackburn today. First, I'll just give the brief introduction of Mr. Chris Blackburn. Mr. Chris Blackburn is the communications director of B Strategic Partners. He has a background in global security, politics, and international relations. Chris works with politicians, law firms, diplomats, think tanks, brands, and businesses to improve communication and strategy. Chris is the head of European outreach at Global Friends of Afghanistan, a US-based think tank. He's also a part of European Bangladesh Forum, EBF. EBF focuses on European security and politics. EBF regularly hosts events on 1971 genocide in Bangladesh and the rise of extremism around the world. So we're really proud and we're really honored to have such an eminent expert today with us. And the topic which we are going to discuss today is a matter of grave concern. Definitely in India, we have faced extremism, terrorism, and radicalization for the last 3-4 decades. And it's been a major challenge for us in society at every level, at a societal level, at an existential level, for the security forces, for intelligence agencies, and for the politicians. But this phenomenon of extremism and radicalization acquiring so much intensity and so alarming proportions in European continent, that is something which is like a shock to most of the Indians. Europe, so far to most of the Indians, was known as a place of peace, prosperity, good governance, and no law and order issues, something like a developed first part of the world. But over the last few years, let's say like 10, 15 years, the kind of extremism and the extremist organizations which are spreading in Europe, that makes it much more similar to the scenario in South Asia. And that is what really generates our interest. So my first question to you, Mr. Chris Blackburn, is just a moment. I'll read out the question. Yes, sir. How do you look at the growing radicalization among immigrant youth and the ever so increasing rate of lone wolf attacks? Yes.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, for your introduction, I think you're right. There is a massive expansion of radicalism, especially in Muslim communities around the world. However, I think when we look at what's happening in France, it's quite a different dynamic than what happens on the Indian subcontinent. In France, and especially in the UK, and I think it's Sweden and Germany, we've had race riots over the last sort of 20, 30 years that haven't had an Islamist component, but do show that in Europe, we do have problems with integration and assimilation and all these kinds of things that do happen around the world when you've got large groups of immigrants coming to your country. But if I compare the UK and France, both countries have a long sort of colonial history. We had a hit like for the last 200 years. Both countries had colonies around the world, and we basically took over. In France's case, they took over places like Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and they had these countries as theirs. They were basically satellites of the mainland France. So for France to then take these immigrants who were under their control and bring them to France and not integrate them properly, we've seen these problems sort of for the last 40 years before the sort of the growth of radical Islamism. So I think, yes, they're connected, but in France's case, it's different than what actually happens in India, I would say.
I do agree with your point that the scenarios are different between the France and India. But you highlighted one point of this race riots in several European countries, and then the arrival of immigrants and this. So I see some sort of the intermingling or the overlapping of the race issues and also the Islamist agenda. Somewhere working as a platform to mobilize or as some kind of a subtext or a context. So I mean, this really takes me back to one famous incident. Back in the times when India was struggling against the Brits, Mahatma Gandhi started this struggle called Khilafat movement in 1920. So the Khilafat movement was essentially an anti-British struggle, and the aim of that struggle was to restore the caliphate in Turkey, because there was the time after the First World War that caliphate was abolished in Turkey, and Mahatma Gandhi started this movement to gather the support of all Muslims against the British with the objective of restoring the caliphate in Turkey. But his underlying objective was to unite the Muslims against the British. But over the period of time, that movement turned completely Islamist and it acquired very extremist overtones. They started massacring Hindus and all. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if, if in Europe also these issues like the race riots, or let's say, some kind of ultra left-wing issues, they get combined with these immigrant issues, and at the background these Islamist agenda is working at a very strong in a very robust manner. So how is this going to unfold?
Well, I think if we solely concentrate on France, they had riots in 2005, and I think it was 2009, in 2017. They had these similar riots where basically it was caused by police brutality rather than an Islamist component. However, we have seen recently that groups of young Muslim men have shouted Allah Akbar when sort of buildings have been set on fire in France or police stations have been attacked. So, but the problem is do we see this as an Islamist sort of insurrection, or is it just Muslims having a riot? And we've got to make that distinction, because like if we look at Leicester, the unrest that happened in Leicester last year, a lot of people said because Hindu gangs shouted Jai Shri Ram that it was a Hindutva inspired incident, where there was no evidence to suggest that. It was just young sort of Hindus. A lot of them were from obviously India, and it became a religious component got mixed in with that, even though there wasn't any real evidence of any organized sort of Islamist or Hindutva inspired sort of violence. So I think in France we've got to be very careful, because in 2005 the police intelligence guy, as they were really cracking down on Islamism, a lot of far-right commentators and a lot of commentators in France were saying, oh, this is what happens when it was like obviously after 9/11, that sort of hysterical sort of like atmosphere we were living in. A lot of commentators were saying, oh, well, what's happening in France, these immigrants, it's something to do with jihad. And there was no evidence on the ground, and the police intelligence said, well, no, these are just basically Muslim men, young Muslim men, who don't have jobs, or they're in very low-paying jobs, and they've used it as an excuse to use violence as a sort of a like entertainment almost. A lot of them didn't understand the real causes of the riots, but they were just doing it out of sort of a fun. And we've seen that with football hooliganism as well in the European continent, that there is a sort of a mob psychology behind these kinds of things. And we've also seen it with the arrests in France. A lot of the Muslim men that have been sent to court, when asked why were you doing it, they basically said, oh, well, I got caught up in the moment. It was seen as a fun thing to do with my friends. And they're getting, 3 or 4 years jail time for what they've done. So I think we've got to look at it with our eyes sort of, we've got to be more sort of critical of our own biases here. So is the Islamist component there? It could be, probably is there, but there's certainly no evidence at the minute to suggest this is a sort of a jihad against the French state.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, definitely for all the researchers and academics working on terrorism and terrorism, you have raised $1 million question. Whether to look at it as some kind of a mob reaction by the Muslims or as an Islamist jihadist insurrections against the state. Well, I mean, I still personally feel that the answer to this question is really difficult. It's a very challenging situation, and definitely there are no clear-cut, very well-established answers. Definitely, it's going to be an ongoing investigation and an exercise, which definitely needs to be explored further. So my next question is about what are the European states doing to address radicalization? Like in England, we just heard about that strategy of PREVENT, but then the latest report said that the PREVENT was not very successful in addressing radicalization issues. In France, Professor Olivier Roy, in his one of his papers, he mentioned that the second generation Muslims, particularly who are disenchanted with the society, they are jobless, unemployment, and some of them were into homosexuality. They had bad breakups, and so they got into terrorism. They joined ISIS. Prison radicalization was a major challenge. So, is there any concrete strategy with a long-term vision to address these issues? I mean, even if this is a mob psychology or some kind of a mob reaction coming from Muslims for various reasons, but at the end of it, finally, it is in some manner contributing to the jihadist radicalization of the people also. So, do you feel that there's any proper strategy from the state side?
Well, I think what you were talking about, the British Prevent and Contest, which was basically the British counter-terrorism strategy, it has gone through, I think it's about, literally on its fifth iteration, because at the very first time it was launched, it literally gave power to groups like Jamaat-e-Islami in the UK, gave power to the Muslim Brotherhood groups who were basically saying, "Oh, it's all your fault. The West needs more Islam," kind of thing. So after that, after there was a challenge by British commentators and people who understood Islamism and understood these groups, the British state had to change contest, had to change prevent. So the British state and others are learning, and I think what's happening on a global level. There's a lot of cooperation between what works and what doesn't. So, say India learns a lot from how the Saudis are dealing with terrorism and de-radicalization and that kind of thing, and it's also looking to the United States and Israel to look at how they're doing things, because nobody's got this sort of the magic bullet. Nobody knows exactly the best thing to do, because we've never really seen this kind of movement happen on a global level in so many different countries. It's like and the United States gets a lot of criticism for being very proactive, and it gets criticism for doing drone strikes in countries or invading or seen to be doing something. So there's a sort of a problem on a global level of how states are responding to it. Are we making things worse? Is the US sort of its actions in Libya and Syria, have they caused more radicalism? And many would argue that yes, it has, because the US has tried to do regime change in these countries. It's led to civil wars. It's led to mass immigration where they've all been coming to Europe. And so, I mean, nobody's got it right. But I think countries learning about the best practices in counterterrorism and in community cohesion, I think we will get there in the end. But I've definitely seen, especially in the cases of the Islamic State, since the sort of the wind down of the actions in Syria. I mean, it's still ongoing, but it's not as intense as it was. Because the war and the conflicts dying down, and ISIS have been reduced, we're seeing across the globe that ISIS is losing its momentum. So. But it's like anything else. If you go at something hard, you can cause a negative reaction that makes things even worse, and it becomes a cycle. And I'd say in Northern Ireland, that's what we saw with the troubles between Catholics and Protestants. That if you go in hard, sometimes it creates generations of mistrust and hatred. So the conflict becomes a perpetual thing that keeps on moving, fueling itself. And at some point, somebody's got to come in, and thankfully for us, it was the Americans who basically tried to bridge peace between warring factions in Northern Ireland. So it's a very difficult one, and because even after Northern Ireland, the peace process has moved so much forward. There are still elements who want to destroy that and to sabotage it, because ultimately there are people who exist, and it doesn't have to be Muslims or Hindus or Christians or Buddhists. There are people who thrive on conflict and who love seeing these tensions in France and other places, and they get a kick out of it. And unfortunately, it's part of the human psyche.
Thank you. Thank you. Definitely. I mean, the US policy in the Middle East opened a can of worms, and I mean, it contributed a lot to this whole global jihadist campaign. And certainly, I mean, there are no second thoughts about it. Even among the terror groups, like they say it very categorically. Like, I was working in Kashmir a while back as a security advisor to the governor, and there I got a chance to interact with the people with the background in militancy who had their exposure to the Middle Eastern terrorist groups, even in Afghanistan. They used to say that, well, I mean, the biggest, support which came to the global jihadist movement was from the US interventions in the Middle East. But still, definitely, I mean, the way we see this whole thing is that, I mean, to categorize it as a globally coordinated jihadist movement will still be a difficult situation. Like, I mean, there are definitely local causes, local factors, and even if some kind of a global coordination is there, then it is in a very loose manner. No, I mean, we cannot say that it's the proper globally coordinated, well organized or hierarchy or structure. Even the transnational terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, they have local chapters who are working according to the local situations. They have autonomy, and in principle, ideologically, they may say the same thing, but their style of operation is very local. And I mean, they're definitely more rooted in the local factors. So coming to that local aspect, so my next question is about the demography. So in India, we always say that there's a very strong demographic angle to this radicalization also. In some of like for example, in some of our border states like Assam and all, the Muslim population has increased a lot. Like, in some of the districts, like, they have become majorities, like in about 10 to 12 districts in Assam. So that is contributing a lot to the radicalization. Also, the places have become safe havens for the terrorist organizations and for the local supporters of the terrorists. So do you feel that in Europe also, if there is a major demographic change in the future, then certainly, I mean, the people belonging to the Islamic faith, they are going to demand, more actions, which are in consonance with with the elements of their faith, with the injunctions of their scriptures, And if that happens, that will be a major threat to the European traditions of democracy and also to the national security. I mean, do you agree with this?
Yeah, I agree because I mean it's already happened. There's groups in the UK and other European countries who've demanded Sharia law and they want to do things their way. And the whole sort of judicial system in Europe is basically everybody's born the same and they should all be under the same laws. And so when you're a society and you start having sort of minorities dictating what the majority or what their minority should be doing, it becomes a very dangerous situation. Um, because there's all sorts of problems with Sharia law. There's the problems of women's rights, individual rights, and it can become like a nasty sort of effect. And I think a lot of Europeans are very scared of mass immigration, and they're scared of people just basically opening up their states to like Syrian refugees. Because on one hand, you have a society who are doing well. These are people fleeing from a war-torn country, and it's a noble thing to be wanting to have refugees. But then the other side, these are people who perhaps aren't or want to change the actual host country's sort of national laws. So it can become a very dangerous, heady mix. And I think that's why a lot of sort of conservative politicians in Europe are very, very interested in the topic because as it has a knock on effect for what I would say the majority, and but then you get the spin off of people who say the white sort of supremacists to say, oh well, we don't want any kind of culture, we don't want Indian culture, we don't want Hindu culture, we don't want Jewish culture. So it becomes a dangerous thing as well to talk about immigration. Because people abuse it. So I think in Europe we are having those discussions, and it's out in the open. Everybody sort of says, "Oh, these things we can't talk about them in public." Everybody talks about it, whether you're on social media, news programs. Everybody discusses these kinds of topics. And it's just how do we ultimately safeguard our values while celebrating diversity. And I think that countries haven't got the sort of the silver bullet that does it well. But as I said, when it comes to security or assimilation and integration, lots of countries just have to learn from each other, and I think that's a good thing.
Thank you. So coming back to your idea of assimilation, integration, I mean, I just have a question. So when we are talking about assimilation and integration, so it's a very fundamental question. Like, as experts, as scholars, as someone who studies political science, international relations, or like governance, government policy, we always talk about assimilation and integration. But then there's an other side to it. I mean, we should also think about whether the Islamic texts, scriptures, what do they talk about assimilation and integration? Is there any provision? Is there any scope? Or is there any validation for assimilation or integration? I mean, this is what we are facing in South Asia. In South Asia, in Pakistan, if you see, in 1947, when Pakistan separated from India, there were about 15% Hindus in Pakistan. Today, it's less than 1%. Christians face everyday attacks in Pakistan. Sikhs face forced conversions. Girls are abducted. There was this lady called Asia Bibi. She was a converted Christian coming from a lower caste in society in Pakistan, and she was charged of blasphemy. She was given a capital punishment. Finally, she got released and she had to leave for US. So that's a society which, when you have a dominant Muslim presence, and when the clerics and the religious clergy defines the rules and the norms of the society, these are the rules which will be prevalent. In Europe also, like if blasphemy becomes a major issue for the Muslims, let's say like if like European values talk about freedom, like writing anything, expressing your opinion. Oh, now that's a major problem with the Islamic clerics. And if blasphemy becomes a major issue, they start killing people who start expressing their opinions. That will be a very, very alarming situation in Europe. And we have faced that kind of situation in India. So in your opinion, like I'm asking your opinion because you just mentioned that the state is still discovering, is still trying to find out the strategies, to address radicalization challenges. But since you are a watcher, you are an avid expert reader, observing these things, what do you think personally should be the solution for this, a long-term solution to address the challenge of radicalization in Europe personally?
Yeah, well, I think my view has always been the two sort of main engines for what we call modern Islamism and jihad has been Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, right? The Saudis now, as a state, have decided that they want to get rid of Wahhabism and they want to embrace modernity, and they're doing many reforms, brilliant things in Saudi Arabia, even having yoga festivals, which would never have happened like 10, 15 years ago, would never have happened in Saudi Arabia. So one of the main engines of jihad in the Muslim world is decided that it is reforming and it wants a different path for its people. And as the patron of the holiest sites in Islam, Saudi Arabia wants the rest of the Muslim world to be on a modern sort of put the past behind it. Pakistan hasn't learned any of those lessons. And this is a dynamic that a lot of Western commentators miss. Not people who study radical Islam like myself and Olivia Roy, who you've mentioned, and there are others who understand it. But I think policymakers don't understand how often Muslim leaders especially Erdogan in Turkey, President Erdogan is starting to get involved in German politics, saying, I've got loads of Turks, loads of diaspora in Germany, and he threatened former Angela Merkel when she was in power. He threatened her. We basically said, I'm going to get my diaspora to sort of interfere in your politics, interfere in your elections. So I think you've got that sort of high level sort of dynamic, and then rightly as you said, there's this sort of the clerics and what's happening on a ground level. But then when you talk to Muslims and you listen to sort of studies in Europe, a lot of the young Muslims don't listen to their clerics anymore. They see them as old, sort of busty, sort of people who are out of touch with the youth. So then you've got these clerics who are trapped now between they used to be sponsored by Gulf states like Saudi Arabia. They're trapped because they don't know what to do anymore. And then you've got the youth, so that you've got all these dynamics within Muslim society. So how that plays out in the long term, I think is going to be quite interesting. So So that's what you're saying is how will that then work its way into national politics in Europe? And I think it's going to be a difficult one because a lot of this sort of traditional cleric are caught between the Saudis like in modernization and they're caught between the youth not listening to them. So these guys are becoming even less relevant. So how they become relevant to their populations and congregations, how they become relevant is going to be a dynamic that I think will be very interesting to watch and will definitely have an impact on radicalization in Europe.
Thank you. You rightly mentioned about Mr. Erdogan, and I'm personally familiar with what Mr. Erdogan does. He was trying to spread his jihadist network across the length and breadth of India. Major intervention in Kashmir. Reach out to the terrorist groups, to the Islamist groups, to the charity groups, and spreading a good network in a very good manner, like a very sophisticated manner. But then I guess the government of India got a little alarmed about it, and then as they started taking actions, I've personally written a very detailed paper on that. With that, I have to make an observation, I think, which is normally sidelined by most of the experts, when we talk about radicalization. With this, immigrant influx and major radicalization in Europe, I don't know how much people are realizing that or not, but Europe is becoming very, very vulnerable to the intelligence footprint of countries like Pakistan and Turkey. And some of these countries are very ruthless in suppressing their dissidents, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey. And they have their covert agents working shamelessly in a very blatant, ruthless manner, no consideration for the rule of law. So if that becomes a routine order in Europe, it'll be a major challenge even for the security of the senior politicians and the people who raise voice against such radicalization. And with this, I also have a question that, now Europe is facing this very intense Islamist radicalization problem. Terrorism is also definitely a major challenge. But the European media and European intellectuals, when it comes to India, their view has not been very positive. Now they're facing this challenge. We have faced this challenge for last 30 odd years, or even more than that. But the coverage in the European media is highly critical. Is mostly about criticizing India on the grounds of human rights. And let me put it very honestly in a very straightforward manner. Most of that reporting is not properly based on evidence and facts. I'm not saying that I'm not supporting India. I'm saying that whatever they write, it has to be based on the proper analysis, proper evidence and facts. If they come to India, they see the facts, and then they should talk the truth. What's the reason for that? Is there some kind of a leftist, liberal, or jihadist nexus, which is working in tandem, which are trying to selectively portray things in the news media or in the intellectual circles?
Well, I think after 9/11 there was a narrative about that Pakistan was an engine of jihad, but then when President Musharraf said, "Oh, I'll fix things for the US," then the narrative swapped. Sorry, I've got a bad cough. So I think you're right. That the Western media, especially with those who study human rights and international relations, and those that study security, there's been a narrative that completely ignores what India's problems. India was a part of the global war on terrorism. It helped the USA. It helped Israel. It was a major sort of a beneficial that we had it there. However, a lot of the print media didn't understand and still don't understand that India has faced deliberate Pakistani intelligence trying to destabilize India. They've done it through the Khalistanis, they've done it in Kashmir, they've tried in Assam, they've tried in Bangladesh. Anywhere that Pakistan can find a division, they have done it, and it's all documented. We've seen the court cases, we've seen people, we've got the evidence. But Western journalists only see India through like a sort of a partition lens, which is quite crazy to say that was 75 years ago. They still see India through that partition lens rather than looking at India as a modern society, and to look at India has been facing an assault by Pakistan as trying to radicalize the Muslim community in India, and it has literally tried mass casualty terrorism to bring India to its knees. And I think a lot of journalists simply don't understand that. And they're always looking at the human rights sort of angle rather than the actual problems that India's faced and how it's trying to negate it. But I mean, there is a new generation of journalists and writers who understand exactly what has happened, and people who became attracted to international relations after 9/11 and who understand things a little bit better. So I think there definitely is a new generation coming through who are more receptive to India's sort of thought process. So hopefully in the future, I think what will happen is this old legacy media, especially the New York Times, the Guardian, and all these guys, they won't stand a chance because of this new media coming through. And I think it'll be good for India, but I think it'll ultimately be good for our countries as well, because these guys have monopolized the debate and twisted narratives. So I think what we'll see is a lot more balanced media going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very honest answer. And my next question is regarding the Khalistan terrorism, Sikh extremism. I mean, if you would like to share your thoughts on that. On that also, we've seen that the Western states are, they're particularly, I mean, I wouldn't blame that. I mean, I wouldn't say that they're exactly sympathetic, but, they've not taken sufficient actions against the Khalistanis. They're threatening Indian ambassadors, diplomats, but still they're being allowed to organize open rallies, protests, and the kind of human rights violations which they have done in the past. They're like really grave, that they're gory, and the European nations are not looking at that. What's the reason? Like, how do you look at that?
Well, I think I mean I was reading a report by the Canadians. They did a report into the Air India disaster, the terrorist attack by the Khalistanis, and they basically said that during the Cold War in 1984 to 1985, that basically Canadians didn't see Khalistanis as such a threat, and they only had like a couple of people working on the issue, like for the whole Canadian government. They had very little actual human resources. They didn't have any spies or confidential informants within Sikh society in Canada. So it just wasn't a priority. And I think what we've seen in the USA, the UK, and Australia when it comes to Khalistanis, it's been seen as an issue that was, well, it hasn't been a priority, put it this way. So I think unless there's a return to the sort of the 1980s style terrorism that Khalistanis were involved in, there is a little bit of leniency that the Brits will just see it as a protest. But I think as we saw with the attack on the Indian High Commission a few I think it was last month or however many months ago it was, the British Foreign Minister and others, the diplomats have said we will not tolerate any kind of attacks. In this protest to be happening tomorrow, the Kill India protest, I think it's called. Hopefully, the British Foreign Secretary came out and says that if there's any attacks on the Indian High Commission or any of their staff, there will be severe consequences. So hopefully there will be a ring of steel around the Indian High Commission in London tomorrow. And I can't see, and I mean, these guys, as you said, there's like, what, 20, 30 absolute maniacs. And
Yes.
fingers crossed, the British finally are aware of the problem and that we do things to reduce the risk.
Thank you. So my last question, what do you think about the possible collaboration, cooperation between Europe and India, when it comes to addressing the issues of radicalization, terrorism?
Well, I
Do
think
you see any hope?
yeah, sorry, there's already cooperation between India. It's India is basically, and in my view, if India had the same level of cooperation with the United States as it has in the sort of the Indo-Pacific with the Quad security sort of alliance, I think that the war on terrorism would have gone a lot better. Because India, I always said India's narrative, and India knew where the engine of jihad was coming from, knew the problem a lot better than American analysts. And if India had been allowed to make the global war on terrorism less Middle East centric, then the world would have been a much safer and better place. So I think as India rises, as India gets the sort of, as India finds its feet at the top, in a lot of countries are now listening to India and are a lot more receptive. I think India will benefit, and India will benefit from European cooperation too, because we've all got to learn a lot from each other. Nobody's ever got it right, but I think having India at the top of that debate and being able to be a key player at the table, I think it's beneficial for the global community, not just India and not just Europe. I think it's a major thing.
Thank you. As an Indian, I can say that, I mean, Pakistan sees Europe as a major center or a support base for its information war against India. And information war, this information arsenal, it's a new and a very robust and a strong weapon in its terrorist, terror arsenal against India. And definitely there's something which is a key component of this, whole terror business, because it gets you help. I mean, it makes you radicalize people, gets you more and more recruits, and also magnify the impact of small terror attacks. So I guess if European countries like, let's say, Germany, France, and some of these states which are really most very developed economies of the world and which are seen as the role model by the societies and countries across the world, if they're supportive, in this war against terror, with India, even with this, information warfare part, then also it will be a major contribution. It'll be a major setback to Pakistan. So thank you so much, Mr. Chris. Definitely it was a pleasure. It was an honor listening to your insightful thoughts on this critical concern. And definitely we'll be uploading the video of this interview soon on our YouTube channel. And in India, I'm pretty sure, most of the people from the media fraternity, from the policy making circuit, they'll be very interested in watching your thoughts, because again, this is also a major problem for us also. And these days, the policy makers are looking for convergences between India and Europe, on the issues like radicalization and counterterrorism. So thank you very much once again. And